This is a typical Faxination server installation. A single dedicated server with all local host and device connectors, a local or on-premise SQL resource, and a local hardware or software-based fax device. The overall messaging volume is limited by the server's hardware resources, CPU and RAM, and there are no failover options. Now, when it comes to messaging volume, every customer scenario is different. Microsoft specifies both minimum and recommended hardware for their Windows Server operating systems. We simply state Microsoft's recommended operating system hardware as the minimum Faxination hardware requirement. But the actual resource requirements are entirely dependent on how the customer is using Faxination. When the fax messaging volume is primarily inbound and a hardware fax device is being used, the CPU usage will be extremely low. The fax card has digital signal processors which are doing all of the telephony work, and there is a minimum of processing required before the fax is delivered to the appropriate host system. Any entry-level server today can easily handle dozens of fax channels in this scenario. However, outbound faxes with large document attachments will generate much more processor load due to document conversion, converting your PDF and Office documents into a faxable format. Software-based fax over IP can also put strain on the CPU when high channel counts are involved, and there is no fax card where the telephony signal processing can be offloaded. So the takeaway here is that the exact hardware requirements for your Faxination deployment involve a huge range of variables. Our Fenestre technical consultants are available to make recommendations based on your messaging volume, direction, the type of telephony, and your budget. And finally, this simple configuration gives you no failover options, meaning that if there is a hardware failure, if a hard drive or a RAM chip fails, for instance, you're in a hard down situation until a human resource can repair the server. And even worse, when you're utilizing remote fax devices, for instance in other countries to provide local numbers to your customers and least cost routing for outbound faxing, the lack of redundancy of the Faxination kernel process effectively means that your entire fax infrastructure is down organization-wide. So what we need is a high availability, fault-tolerant design. We need to ensure that there is no single point of failure, no single component that can fail and take the entire system down with it. Active-passive clustering is a good high availability option. It's based purely on Microsoft Windows Server features, so there is no special hardware required, although you will need something like a SAN for shared file storage. You also need a SQL resource outside of the cluster for the fin messaging database, and that SQL resource should be in a high availability configuration. We also need a place for the Faxination queue to live that's independent of the primary cluster nodes. So there is a second active-passive cluster to run the Faxination queue service, and that will also tie into your SAN resource. In this design, each node of the primary cluster has its own fax device with enough channels to meet your peak demand. The fax lines themselves are pooled at the PBX level so that whatever device answers is the one that handles the call. The fax card in the passive node will not answer an inbound call when its Faxination services are offline. Variations in this design? The nodes could be running software-based fax over IP, in which case the gateway would be configured to establish inbound connections to the cluster instead of the individual nodes. If a high availability SQL resource is unavailable, you could install the SQL services within the Faxination queue cluster. The SQL resource is a single point of failure for Faxination, so it's important that it be in a high availability configuration wherever it exists. If you don't have a SAN, Microsoft Active-Passive Clustering can also work with iSCSI network-attached storage. Just keep in mind that a true SAN typically implies storage replication and fault tolerance, whereas an iSCSI or a NAS configuration may or may not be fault tolerant, and that could represent another single point of failure. Now you could, theoretically, set up your active-passive with no separate queue or shared storage. The problem here is that if a fault is detected and a failover occurs when there are jobs in the queue currently being processed, those jobs will be orphaned on that server, and depending on the nature of the failure, like if it's a local hard drive for instance, those jobs may be lost forever. For that reason, we can't really recommend this design, but it is significantly less expensive than the other options due to the reduced hardware requirements. For a high-volume implementation, load balancing is the preferred option. In this design, we have 2 or more Faxination kernel machines running in parallel but completely independent of one another. We have the same requirements for an external, high-availability Faxination queue and SQL resource that we did for the active-passive design. But here we're adding a hardware load balancer. Citrix, Cisco, and F5 are the most common ones that we see in customer environments. The hardware load balancer creates the cluster entity on the network and distributes incoming connection requests equally between the Faxination nodes within the cluster. The load balancer can monitor the services of the individual nodes and take a node offline if it detects a problem, effectively providing both load balancing and fault tolerance in a single solution. Software-based load balancing is also possible, but has really lost favor in recent years. The method of load balancing that the customer prefers is completely irrelevant to Faxination, and we don't recommend one over the other. Most, if not all, of our customers are using hardware load balancers. Faxination integrations with Microsoft Exchange and Office 365 typically include Active Directory integration. For that, we need to add information to the domain user accounts that is specific to Faxination. We reserve a place to store that information by using an Active Directory Schema extension. For an analogy, we can compare Active Directory to a library, a place to store information. Within that library, we have a section dedicated to information about our domain users. If we imagine that the information is stored on shelves within that library, then extending the Active Directory schema is like adding some new shelves to the domain users section of the library where we will store Faxination-specific information. To extend the Active Directory schema, run setup from the Faxination 2016 distribution, and the Schema Extension utility is the second option. You can also run the Schema Extension tool directly from the FFS SCHEXT folder. The menus are straightforward, and you'll have multiple opportunities to cancel the operation. In most cases, you'll want to perform a full schema extension. Again, you need to confirm multiple times that this is what you want to do. And the schema extension is completed in just a few seconds. Of course, Active Directory is the heart and soul of most of the world's organizations, so you may be a bit nervous about allowing a third-party utility to go in and make changes to it. I can tell you that we've been using this automated approach since Active Directory was first introduced in Windows Server 2000, and we've never had a reported incident where the utility caused a problem. If you're still concerned about it, Fenestre support can provide an LDIF file that you can use as a reference to manually extend the schema for Faxination using ADSI Edit. However, if you choose to go that route, you're on your own, as we only provide support for the Schema Extension utility, and we stand behind that method as the best and safest way to extend the schema. Now, in large organizations, we recommend extending the Active Directory schema at least 24 hours ahead of putting Faxination in production, and that is to allow for all of your domain controllers and global catalog servers to replicate the information. Before the schema is replicated, the server may report LDAP query failures when trying to process messages. If that's an issue, you can either force replication or wait for the problem to sort itself out. Next, we need to create a service account that is dedicated for Faxination. If your installation includes Active Directory integration, Domain Administrator or the equivalent aggregate permissions are required to read and modify Active Directory object attributes. If you're using an existing SQL resource on your network, the Faxination service account will need SQL database creator permissions there. Otherwise, you can use the service account to install a local instance of SQL where it will have database creator permissions by default. If you're using our native Exchange connector interface, you'll need at least view-only Exchange permissions for the installer to create the foreign connector gateway automatically. And yes, this is counterintuitive, but the view-only groups do have that ability. Also note that the exact name of the view-only permission group has changed several times since Microsoft introduced foreign connectors in Exchange 2007. Once the foreign connector has been created and tested, the Exchange permissions can be removed. There are no specific Exchange permissions required for normal operations, as the foreign connectors use a drop folder type interface and an admin share or UNC path. If you want to use the Faxination service account to extend the Active Directory schema, it needs to have schema admin permissions during install. Once the schema extension is confirmed, you can remove that permission from the service account. Typically, an administrator will just run the schema extension utility using their own account. Regarding SQL, it's important to know that SQL services represent a single point of failure for Faxination. If you do not have a high availability SQL resource in your environment, it is recommended to install a local SQL instance on the Faxination server itself. SQL Express 2014 SP1 is provided with the Faxination 2016 distribution, in which case you'll want to specify the local instance name or local host during installation. If you'll be using the Faxination SMTP stack, you'll need to choose a unique virtual domain name to use for addressing and DNS routing. In our examples, we use fax.sys, and we configure that in the local DNS as an A or an MX record that resolves to the IP address of the Faxination server. Using the fax.sys virtual domain name, the outbound addressing format would be faxnumber@fax.sys. Your mail system will perform a DNS query on fax.sys and then make a connection to port 25 on the Faxination server to deliver the message for processing. Faxination 2016 is supported on Windows Server 2008 R2, 2012, 2012 R2, and 2016. Also, several Windows components are required. Most of these will already exist in a standard Windows Server installation, and you'll be prompted to install any components that are not detected during the Faxination installation. Some document conversion operations require the Desktop Experience feature to be installed, and you'll need to do that manually. Take a look at the Faxination 2016 Getting Started guide for more information. The latest Windows Server operating systems don't allow us to use Microsoft Office for document conversion, so we've introduced the Faxination Generic Document Converter. It supports hundreds of different file types, pretty much every type of file used in a business context in the past 2 decades or so. However, you still have the option of using OpenOffice to convert standard Office files. Similarly, you can use Adobe Acrobat, GoScript, or the Generic Document Converter for the conversion of PDF files. There are a couple of scripts in the Fenestre kernel folder that allow you to choose which conversion methods you prefer. These scripts require elevated permissions, which you can either do manually or through the Select Conversion Elevated VBS script. It's basically one script that launches the other scripts with the elevated permissions. If you wish to use OpenOffice or GoScript, you'll need to download and install those products manually. Both are free. If you wish to use Adobe Acrobat for PDF conversion, it must be the full version and not the free Acrobat Reader version, and it must be installed manually. The Faxination Web Service Connector requires the .NET Framework version 2.5 SP1 and the Web Service Enhancement version 3.0. The installers for these are included in the Faxination 2016 distribution. If you're upgrading from an older version of Faxination and have web service applications that you've written or commissioned, these may need to be updated for the Web Service Enhancements 3.0 or Windows Communication Foundation. WCF is the preferred web service interface now and is available in all of the latest releases of Microsoft Visual Studio. The Fenestre Trace tool includes a feature that allows you to save traces in XML format and reload them back into the Trace tool for viewing at a later time. This feature requires XML Parser 4.0 Service Pack 2. If you're collecting traces to submit to Fenestre support, we actually prefer the traces to be in plain text instead of XML. So this XML parser is optional. If you'll be using Faxination along with a local hardware fax device, you'll want to install that fax device in the chassis before Faxination is installed. If the card comes with drivers and software, you'll want to install those and test the card independent of Faxination. The noted exception to this is with Brook Trout cards, which do not ship with drivers or software. Those are included as part of the Faxination BFax TRX Stream device connector installation. For software-based fax over IP devices, the Brook Trout SR140 is built into the Faxination BFax TRX Stream device connector, so there is nothing to install beforehand. Likewise, the Faxination FOIP device connector has no prerequisites. The one you choose really comes down to the telephony system, gateway, or SIP trunk that you'll be interfacing with. For the Cappy software-based fax over IP solution, you'll need to install the Cappy software before the Faxination Cappy device connector. Cappy is a good solution for SIP trunks and certain telephony systems. Our consultants can help you decide which solution is best for your particular scenario. For mobile devices, GSM modems typically come with software that creates a COM port serial interface to a USB device. For virtual environments, you may also have a third-party software that creates a COM port that communicates with a device over an IP network. In either case, you'll want to install and configure that software before installing Faxination. For internet-based SMS and MMS services, you'll need to create an account with your service provider and have the credentials and connection information ready during the Faxination installation.